Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining the Digital Infrastructure panel. I see quite a number of attendees there and people continuing to log in, but we'll get going and they can join in on the conversation. Quite an important conversation to be having, one of the most important in my view, given COVID right now and what is going on in the South African economy and in the whole entire world. It's quite interesting because COVID has essentially pushed us into a more digital way of doing things, from running the economy to running your businesses. And I do know that a lot of people are itching to get back to the office. Working from home and learning from home is not everyone's cup of tea. But even as we do go back or go forward into this new normal, as it were, I imagine that a lot of us will be bringing in the benefits of doing things digitally and remotely. We've seen the efficiency gains, we've seen the productivity gains, and it really doesn't make sense to leave it behind. So in this new normal, we are seeing that a lot of players in the global system are investing quite heavily in their digital economy, and South Africa can't afford not to do the same, and it has risen to the occasion, and this is what this infrastructure panel discussion is going to be about, hearing about the projects that the government does have on the pipeline. The Minister will present that to us shortly. We will also have a panel of experts who will be walking through these projects with us, assessing their merits and their opportunities, as it were, and also providing their expert advice how to quickly action them and make them implementable. We will then open up to you as attendees to provide your input. And in fact, there's no need to even wait until the end of the session to ask your questions. You can do so as the speakers are speaking, provide any comments on what has been said. You can ask any questions. You will be muted. Your mics will be muted just to ensure that we do have an uninterrupted discussion, but you're more than welcome to use the Q&A box that you should see to the bottom of your screens, and I will certainly get and address your questions as they come. I do know quite a number of people are also watching this event on social media, and we look forward to hearing your comments from you as well. Just to make sure that we do pick up what it is you say, you can use that hashtag SIDSSA 2020 or SIDSSA 2020. But let's get the ball rolling. Let's get the panel started. And on that note, I'd like to introduce to you as attendees our themed panel, beginning with the Honorable Ms. Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, who is the Minister of Communications, Telecommunications, and also Postal Services here in South Africa. Also joining the panel is Dr. Andile Ngcaba, the Commissioner for the President's 4IR Commission and also the Chairman of Convergence Partners. We have Dalibor Vavruska, the founder of Digitex Associates, an independent consultant and also a thought leader on digital transformation. And last but not least, Professor Brian Armstrong, who is the chair of the digital business at the University of Witwatersrand. To the panel, welcome. And Minister, to begin with you, as in observe the protocol, I'd like to get some of your thoughts or introductory remarks as we kick off this discussion. When President Ramaphosa initially announced that the Sustainable Infrastructure Investment Symposium would be taking place, it was around February, I believe the 18th to be exact, and it was before we faced some of the headwinds that we are facing now, and I speak specifically about the health crisis in the form of COVID-19. I'm just interested in your thinking about the digital infrastructure landscape as it currently stands now, and also compared to what your mindset was pre-COVID-19 times. Minister?
Thank you so much, Fifi, and good afternoon to the panelists and the attendees in their respective areas. And yes, I must just pass one message first to say, let's stay home and stay safe. But of course, because I'm also the minister responsible for communications and digital technologies, not communications and telecommunications. I just wanted to clarify that. And as I'm on that note, it therefore tells you that as I'm saying to people, stay home, it means I'm also saying at the same time, there are the digital technologies that can enable your remote working. Fifi, you're asking me a very important question. when President made the announcement of the infrastructure symposium, it was before COVID, and then COVID happened. And therefore, do I still have the same thinking and plan prior to having witnessed what we have all witnessed, to say it is possible that people may not be able to go to their fancy buildings. It is possible that people may not be able to go to school, but therefore, what is it that we need to do? I always say, I think COVID has really given us a great opportunity as the people in the sector, because it has helped us as of South Africa to leapfrog directly to what we're working towards, that of building the digital society. So it has really also at the same time exposed the weaknesses in the infrastructure that we have. Because as much as we talk about the digital natives, as we talk about all the societies, but we have seen people who became outcasts, not out of their own making, but because the infrastructure and the accessibility to the technologies was never made possible for them. This is why we are excited to be part of this dialogue, to say, how do you make sure that we can build a capable and sustainable digital infrastructure in order to enable everyone to be digital native, but not just people to be consumers, and people to participate meaningfully in the value chain that we're talking of.
Very great insights and great questions that we will be answering throughout the discussion. Thank you so much. And Andile, just to bring you in here, yesterday when we were preparing, because when you prepare, you have a better chance of doing better, as it were. When we were preparing for this discussion, what was important to you was to break down what was meant by digital infrastructure. And I do think that that is a very simple but important question. So just give us your take and include in that in your introductory remarks, but also your mindset, because the 4IR commission that was set up by the president has been doing a lot of work. And I do understand that consultations have been extensive. And I'm wondering if throughout these extensive engagements you've been having, whether preparation for an unprecedented event like COVID-19 was documented somehow or some way in those copious papers that I hear the 4IR Commission has come up with.
Fifi, thank you very much. Firstly, let me greet the Honorable Minister and thank you for hosting this very important event, in particular at this time. We really were, all of us, absorbed this morning, listening to the proceedings started by the President earlier today. I think there are a lot of lessons to pick up from that session. That are really linked or connected to what we are talking about. My context to this, I hope I will have an opportunity to present a slide a bit later, that we just need to understand the ecosystem of what we define as the digital infrastructure first, before we can slice it and dice it and look at it and say which part connects to which part and what is urgent. The way in which I understand that ecosystem is as follows. One, you have a variety of different types of technologies. These are fiber in the ocean, on land, and fiber connecting to you at home. Two, you have data centers that all our data sits. Three, you have the spectrum used to connect us wirelessly. And then four, you have what is called high altitude platforms or satellites that connect to various remote areas. And then, of course, you have got big data and artificial intelligence. All these sit on top of the internet. Now, all these things, for them to work, you need funding. And that funding comes in the form of equity or debt or bonds or in any other form of funding for any of these things to happen. And then from there, moving down towards the policy side, we need to think about the economy, or we need to think about digital infrastructure as an integral part of the economy. What I mean by that all policies and laws of the economy must actually dovetail with what we define as the digital infrastructure or digital economy. In our view, in my view, that open source or open access or open data should form the foundation for that model that we have to define as a country. Now, clearly for all the things that must work, you need laws and policies and regulations, right? Now, on the extreme side, then you have different sectors of the economy, such as agri-tech or fintech or ragtech or edutech or medtech or digital twinning or clean tech or smart grid. That is how I see the full architecture or ecosystem to service people in urban, rural, citizens in business and in society. I'll stop here for now.
Thanks, Andile, and we look forward to those further engagements or slicing of the digital pie, as you put it. But Dalibor, to bring you in also for your introductory remarks, I imagine that your work consulting various businesses and governments all over the world has picked up quite considerably since the COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately landed, because what it did do is it did expose the vulnerability in the digital plans of many nations. But just your take on the world as it currently is, but more importantly, your bird's eye view from your part of the world of South Africa's digital landscape.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Fifi, and thank you, the Honorable Minister, and everyone here. It's a real pleasure for me to be part of this debate. I'd like to give you some external views. I've been in the telecoms and technology industries for about 25 years, and I always try to look at things from independent perspective and try to find, if possible, or where possible, win-win situations, win-win arrangements between different stakeholders. And I think to do that, you really need long-term policy visions or long-term visions that partially come from the government, come from some kind of substantive debate among the different stakeholders. So I fully subscribe to the Honourable Minister's comment that we should forget telecoms and look at digital. That's why I call this my initiative, my thought leadership, and my consulting Digitex, which it combines the technology, connectivity, and service angle. I truly believe that that's the way forward to grow economy, and that's the way forward to grow it in a sustainable way, which are two very important principles that we talk about. We also talk about potential challenges. They are challenges around human centricity. There are challenges around freedoms. I mean, there are parties that may want to use the technologies in a way that the consumers or the voters may not want to. So I think that we have to talk about protection, and we have to talk about how the consumer gets protected through free market mechanisms, but also through the national governments, because that's the proxy of the voters, and that's to me very important. I picked up in the morning in a very interesting sessions, and in particular, Dr. Ramakgopa mentioned that the three priorities in terms of GDP or economic growth. In terms of innovation, I would emphasize local innovation, the differentiation, whatever happens within the country differentiates the country from a competitive perspective, and then the role of the government to sort of oversee that transformation. So I'm very keen to have these discussions, to participate in these discussions with government. I just wanted to show, we published earlier this month this report about 5G policies with some thoughts. I understand that we don't have now time to go through all of this, but I just wanted to give you the 5 thoughts to think about, or maybe to set the debate. One is about opening of not only infrastructures, but also technology standards and data platforms. It's not possible to open everything all the time, but it's possible to discuss what should be open, how should be open, and how to form long-term policies around that. The second thing is around being smart about use of spectrum, potentially allowing private networks, dynamic spectrum access, other things, just to open up the idea about how spectrum is used, but in a very fair way to the stakeholders that are in the industry, because I believe, I'm a true believer that the current telecommunication companies can substantially transform themselves and substantially help the economies. That's my third point in terms of the role of the telecoms, as, if you want, the national data guardians or guardians of the data sovereignty and of the data of private entities and the public entities. We also talk about potential synergies between different infrastructures. So we shouldn't see the digital infrastructure as a standalone infrastructure. There may be other things that it's synergetic with. And of course, the topic of security, health, and control of freedom. So these are our key topics, and I'll be very happy to elaborate in some of those also in the South African context.
Thanks so much, Dalibor. We'll get to those in just a moment. I think a lot of the attendees would look forward to more detail on those 5 points. Just one request to our panelists. Would love to see your beautiful faces. So please, can you make sure that your videos are switched on? Dr. Andile, speaking to you. I would love to see you, and particularly for the recording of the stream. And also just muting the mics, if we could all just mute our mics when we are not finished. I mean, rather when we are finished talking, just to make it a lot easier for the attendees to participate in the engagement. Prof. Brian, finally, last but not least, I've spoken to quite a number of students, and I'm surprised. I'm surprised to hear from them that learning from home is not all that. Some of them are really wanting to get back to the campus. But of course, even if that does happen, a lot of the online learning will still be in place. I'm interested in your introductory remarks as we do continue this conversation around South Africa's digital economy.
Thanks, Fifi, and Minister, thanks for having me, and to my fellow panelists and everybody online, good afternoon. Really thank you for inviting me to participate, and it's my pleasure and privilege to try to contribute. So this seminar is part of a broader thing about sustainable infrastructure development for South Africa across a number of sectors. And I think it is important to recognize that although we're talking digital, it happens in a time of COVID. And I think that has changed the game in many ways, as the Minister mentioned. And I think it probably, with regard to digital, it's changed. There's at least 5 things that we can learn from this time of COVID. I think the first thing is the 4th industrial revolution doesn't immunize us from the so-called 3rd or even 1st and 2nd industrial revolution realities, many of which are very prevalent in South Africa. So it is right, I think, that digital infrastructure and this conversation around the digital ecosystems has to be part of an integrated infrastructure strategy. And hence the broader SIDSSA program, I think, is very much to be welcomed. I think, secondly, COVID has shown us that on the one hand, much of the economy can go on if people are properly connected. Many firms, including my own organization, you mentioned our students are at home. We carried on. And many people I speak to have been as busy as ever or busier. And I think that demonstrates the incredibly empowering potential of digital ecosystems. I think a third thing COVID has done is it has accelerated the transition of many sectors, including education, my own, and others like retail, to more digital formats. And I think these digital transformations are potentially very transformative beyond the direct effects in their industries in question. So, for example, digitalization of education, of access to finance, of access to healthcare, of access to basic goods and services, can have a massive impact on spatial inclusion, a priority that came out of this morning's session, social cohesion. Fourthly, I think what is important, and I've learned this with my students, you think I'm dealing with postgrad students, they've all got access, right? I think at the same time as remote working and virtual work has been a reality and a lifeline for many of us, what we've seen is that there are many people who cannot and do not participate in this virtual way, and are particularly vulnerable to the extraneous shocks like COVID, and are excluded from the transformation into a digital economy. So the democratization of digital infrastructure is absolutely critical, which is again why I think this process is to be welcomed. And then finally, you mentioned some of my students are not too keen to carry on online. They like being in the classroom. There's a social dynamic to it. And I think the lockdown has reminded us of the importance of human and social priorities. Technology and infrastructure doesn't exist in isolation of the social and economic context and human realities, both in terms of what people want, what they embrace, what they treasure. And therefore, we need to, when we think about, Andile made the point about digital infrastructure versus the digital ecosystem or the digital economy. We have to take a long-term view and we have to be vision-driven, but it will not be sustainable if it doesn't, if it's just about infrastructure. If we don't think about the ecosystem and the human needs that it supports and the broader notion of digital inclusion, I think we are going to be missing a trick. So finally, to wrap up these opening comments, I think we do need a long-term vision. We need to be strategically driven. But a comment that also came out of this morning is we've got to get to execution. I lecture strategy now, and we all know that a great strategy that's badly executed, you might as well not have it. So we need to focus on the right strategy, find the right projects, make the right strategic choices, and then really focus on execution. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof. So let's talk about those projects now. Minister, if you could just let us know what is on the go. You did start off by mentioning something that has been recurred throughout the speakers, and that is what COVID-19 did by exposing the outcasts and those that didn't have the privilege to continue learning from home or to continue working from home. So essentially, our inequalities were really laid bare and magnified. And I'm just interested in your kind of thinking around projects perhaps that can immediately address some of the needs of South African society. Of course, health would be top of mind there, but things like education and also social development as well. What's in store, Minister?
Thank you so much, Fifi. As I mentioned earlier, linking to what the two last panelists have mentioned, the importance of digital ecosystem. As I laid foundation to say, for you to have that, we've got to make sure that we've got a stable infrastructure. So I needed to make that because as the policymaker, I have a responsibility to work with the industry players to say, how do we then go about making sure that we provide that infrastructure? But key to what you are asking, Fifi, in terms of the interventions from our side as the department. One of the things that we're embarking on right now is the issue of developing the digital economy master plan, which will therefore look into the entire ecosystem, whether you talk about the digital core, everything in terms of the technologies, the services, and everything that we're talking about. We will be finalizing that process by the end of August. The team has informed me that by end of June, we will have a first draft, which again is canvassed with the entire industry players, not only industry players in the ICT, but cutting across all the industries that we have in the country. We had, and I think I've also heard this when the president was also hosting his session, most people have spoken about spectrum, even here in the panelists. We issued a policy direction last year, 2019, July, to say the authority must consider some policy objectives when it's moving towards the licensing of the spectrum. As I'm speaking to you, the authority has given me information that by the end of June, they will be issuing the ITA. They are aware that by the end of December, they would have licensed the spectrum. You do consider again the fact that in the policy and policy direction that we issued, we then proposed a hybrid model which spoke to the release or the licensing of the high demand spectrum at an auction level or whatever method that the authority feels comfortable with. And then the other one that is on open, the open wholesale system that we're talking about, whereby we're saying we want everybody not necessarily to own, but to say how do we utilize the available spectrum. And when we do that because we're appreciative of the fact that as much as government, we want to see money in the spectrum, but there's value in making sure that people must utilize the spectrum in order to not to only deliver transformation, but to ensure that even those that have not managed to have access in the spin-offs of the spectrum that has been licensed prior, they can have access to it. I'm talking about those that are in the rural areas and the townships. Therefore, to say now we're bringing these two processes, the one that is on one and the other one, which I have been reliably informed, as I said, the other one is on end December, the other one is in Q2 of the next financial year. I am having a meeting again on the 25th. With the regulator, where I'm still trying to see, can't we engage each other and see if we can be able to fast track the process, because we really would love a situation whereby the spectrum can be released to all, and therefore all the innovators and everybody that needs to utilize the spectrum, then they can have access to it. That's number two in terms of the interventions that I spoke about. The third one is on rolling out what we refer to as SA Connect, which is the department's or the government's broadband rollout plan. But in that, we're busy with a feasibility study as I'm speaking to you. DBSA is the one that commissioned the study. They have said they'll be done by end December. I'm hopeful, as I've arranged a meeting again with the CEO of IDC, sorry, no, not DBSA, as I have arranged a meeting to say, can we sit down and see? Because at times you want to do things that are already there. I do believe that the industry may have most of the information that goes to the feasibility study. How do we then make sure that we work together in a coordinated method that will then help us fast track the execution that we seek to achieve? The third one, again, is the BDM, the Broadcasting Digital Migration Process, because as I spoke about releasing spectrum, again, there is this big elephant in the room that we've been talking about for years as the South African government, that of migrating broadcasters from digital to analog. And we have already set up a date to say, come what may, by next year we should have switched off everyone. But what we're saying, as much as we appreciate that other people do have access to funding themselves in terms of buying the necessary devices, as government, you also have to look at the poor, which we have taken a decision that we're not going to hold people, those that can migrate, because we're still trying to look at the poor, which is why amongst the other projects that we're looking at in terms of investment is that digital migration process, to say how can we come together, of which we realize that the use of set-top boxes, the DTT boxes, has been outdated. Hence, we then cabinet approved that we avail the IDTVs for the poor households, but any other device that can help one migrate to those that afford is acceptable. The fourth one is the issue that I spoke about earlier, of saying, as we look into the digital infrastructure, as people were talking about, but Andile or Dr. Ngcaba raises another important angle that we should look at. I think also Brian mentioned this. As we look into the ecosystem, who are these people that are producing this fiber? Because ours as government is to make sure that we balance. As much as we drive the service that people must access, we must also make sure that people participate meaningfully. As we're going to be licensing spectrum, who are the people that will be building the towers? And where do the batteries and other components of the towers come from? So we're working with the Department of Trade and Industry, with the Department of Science and Innovation, to say, let's come together and make sure that we come up with a plan that will help that at least the money is retained in the country. Because what we have been observing currently is the fact that pledges are made, we're going to offer 50 billion, but when you look into the breakdown of the investment, you find that South Africa is left with 5 billion. How do we utilize this opportunity of bridging the digital divide by enabling those, but make sure that the money gets to be then reinvested back in South Africa in order to create jobs, but most importantly, to make sure that people have better services. So as we do that, again, in the digital economy master plan, that's there, then to say what incentives we can then bring. And as I spoke of the departments that we are working with, I just forgot SARS through Treasury that we're working with, to encourage manufacturing. We have 11 million learners in South Africa as we talk about digitalizing education. We have 11 million learners. We have more than 3 million educators. I'm not talking about public servants and anybody else. That already tells you that there is a market because as I said, COVID has helped us fast track that we thought that it's impossible to happen. Everybody saw the need, whether they're earning grants, but they saw the need to go and buy a tablet and any other device that they needed. How do we then build on that? To say, as we help bridge this divide, we provide this digital education, but manufacturing is done here. And that doesn't mean that when we say manufacturing is done in South Africa, strictly a South African company, but we are saying all those that are OEMs that have the capability to produce this, they must at least have factories here. But they must also consider in their value chain ensuring that they use components from South Africa. If I were to make an example with one of the greatest minerals that we have, the manganese, that is also needed when we talk of the devices, how do we make sure that we get this delivery in a coordinated and collaborative manner that does not only seek to say, yes, we've built a digital society, but at the same time as we built that society, it has also helped us turn around our economy. Those are the interventions that we are working on. As I said, the Presidential Commission, Dr. Ngcaba, I think is going to talk to that, has just given me the report that we'll be handing over to the President. And until that time, we'll get into details once Cabinet approved. But there are very clear directives that we can build on as the country in order to leverage in the current crisis that we are faced with. So far, I will pause. Oh, the last thing. We can be talking about everything, all those services, as long as people are participating in the internet. Privacy is key, and we all agree that data is the new oil. And therefore, if data is the new oil, it tells you that we've got to do everything to protect it, not just for people's privacy, but also to give access to the small businesses and other people that must use it in order to inform their own planning and commercial interventions that they want to introduce. I will pause there for now. And of course, South Africa has to be the hub for all this infrastructure that we're talking about so that it can service the entire continent. Thank you, Fifi.
Thank you, Minister. I agree with you and quite a lot of the things that you have said, and particularly by way of, manufacturing and boosting the local manufacturing sector and ensuring that the inputs are actually from South Africa. We've seen what COVID-19 has done in terms of when you're so dependent on one country and something goes wrong in that country and you've got a disruption to supply, we can't have things coming to a standstill as a result. And even in terms of the things that you spoke about regarding investments and all these pledges that we have seen, we've seen billions being pledged to be invested here in South Africa. And I'm surprised when you say that, a lot of the money, the pledges, not everything came here in the country. But what we have seen from corporate South Africa also is a very bad track record in getting value by taking money to the UK or taking money to Australia. So certainly the money is there, and it will be interesting to discuss with the panel how we ensure that the money stays here. Dr. Andile, the baton was passed to you, as it were, and I'd like you and all the other panelists, in fact, just to comment on some of the things that the Minister has said, the various projects and initiatives that are being worked on, from the Digital Economy Master Plan, Spectrum, and also rolling out of SA Connect, and the broadcast digital migration processes were some of the things that she mentioned. Dr. Andile, before you do answer, however, there's a question coming from the attendees. They're asking if the slide that you will be presenting can also be shared to them at a later stage so they can get copies.
Oh, for sure. Yes. I will email you as soon as I'm done. Can I jump into it? I mean, to take off from what the Minister said, data is the new oil. I think that is the trust. I mean, everything he said is, exceptional, but I'm just going to zoom into the issue of data as a new oil. If I may present, do you mind if I do that very quickly?
Go ahead, please. Are you able to share your screen with us so we can see? Perfect. We do have your screen with us. We can all see your screen. Yeah, I think we can all see your screen. You can go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fifi. Again, Minister, thanks for your time. And Brian and Dalibor, thanks. And all other panelists that are here. The way in which I've structured this, as I've said, is very simple. I mean, as I've said, I mean, picking up what the minister said, I mean, the minister talked about spectrum, you know, fiber, and all these. These are all what I call integral parts of the ecosystem. Now, these are supposed to be backed up, as the minister said, by policy and all the engagements that she talked about in government. I think the critical part is in that middle layer of the market structure where the private sector will be to be able to build and do all these. But I put them in the middle of the ecosystem because you need funding to do this. As I've said, debt, equity, MES, from private equity, from venture capital funds, from development finance institutions, from bonds, from equities, as I've said. On the other extreme, I mean, you have all sectors of the economy. I think it's critical, Fifi, to state that, you know, when we talk about digital infrastructure, digital economy, is not only about us as a sector, it touches almost every aspect. Now, one of the issues that South Africa is really key and central in the area of us having access to both the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And the fact that we are this hub connecting Africa on the west side and on the eastern side. This is a great position to be. In particular, now that there are 2 or 3 new cables that are coming. If you look at the cables that I've presented before, the average size of each of these cables is about 15 terabits per second. Now, these new cables, one will be opened or launched in 2022. Basically, this cable is 100 terabits per second. The 2 Africa cable is again 180 terabits per second. This is almost 20 times the amount of international capacity that we have. So as South Africa, we are moving in a direction of truly becoming connected to the world. Not only that, but becoming that hub of the Southern Hemisphere and the African continent. Now, if I leave then connectivity and come to cloud, we all are aware that about 2 months ago, AWS launched their region in Cape Town, and Azure, Microsoft already, they are here. I think as a country, we need to develop strategies to bring more cloud providers in South Africa to become a central hub of cloud computing and hyperscale. This is in the process of happening. We need to accelerate this model. Open source is key. Without open source, there's no future. And really, as an industry, we are busy with all the conversations amongst ourselves as not just in South Africa, but the continent, to be able to drive open source. We are fortunate the fact that Ubuntu, as one of the largest open source platforms, is born out of this country. Now, just to indicate some milestones of successes this country has seen, we basically, I mean, have participated in a number of these events. Last year in November, Minister and the delegation were part of the WRC discussing issues of 5G. Now, all these frequencies are now decided by what is called WRC 19, which was in Egypt. And this is paving way for further debate of spectrum in another World Radio Conference of 2023 and another one of 2027. Now, why do I raise this? 2027 will be discussing 6G. We have 10 years as a country to execute on this 5G so that we are not late for the next generation, which will be 6G that will come in around 2027. Coupled with that, as I've said, we talked about these hyperscale AWS Azure that are already here. Inside the report coming out of the 4IR, we muted the establishment of an AI institute in Africa, which I'm sure the minister in the near coming weeks will talk about it. I've talked about these cables, which are central to us as a country. And what I'm saying, colleagues, that we are sitting in a sweet spot where we sit today as a country to lead the continent in the digital revolution. and all the building blocks are there. What do we need to do? We need to change the following laws in order to allow, for instance, for mobility. I mean, what I call mobility is all autonomous vehicles. These are the laws that need to be changed for us to allow drones to happen, for us to allow smart grids to happen, for us to allow CubeSats, and all these new technologies. We need to quickly amend these laws in order for us to really accelerate what we define as digital transformation. For instance, if you take fintech, there is no reason for us that all mobile devices can be used to pay people on social grants, so that we remove queues and some of the heists that we see. This can be done quickly and fast and be able to address some of these challenges that the country is experiencing. What I'm saying here, Fifi, in addressing 5G, because of the concept of dynamic spectrum allocation and slicing, we need to look at 5G not in the same way as 4G or 3G. 5G is a platform, is not a network, and therefore the way we address spectrum has to be very different. Now, let me move to issues of agri-tech, edu-tech, e-sport. All these are issues that are happening in the country already, and that we need to amend these laws to make sure that this country can be truly digital. So those are a few slides that I felt I needed to share just to give context to what the minister was talking about. Thank you again, and I will pass on the baton to the next panelist, or through you. Thanks.
Thanks, Andile. And you know, I see that now there are more presentation, or there's more slides. I don't know how many of the attendees were able to see all the slides as you were talking through them, but if you didn't see everything that Andile was mentioning as he was talking, he has said that his slides will be available, and you can get to it that way. So I'd like to gather the other panelists' thoughts also on what the minister had to say. You know, as you're talking 6G, I'm thinking, wow, 5G, I'm experiencing it currently, having to work from home, and it is pretty fast. It's quite nice. But a lot of South Africans, in fact, in the informal and the rural areas, are currently on, or most of them use 2G phones, mobile devices, I am told. And as the release and the imminent release of spectrum will certainly go a long way in ensuring that 4G is rolled out in this country, and even 5G. We've seen a lot of the independent players also getting ready to do that. I'd like to bring in you, Dalibor, just to, again, off-take from what the minister has said by way of the projects that we have got and the initiatives that we have got in the pipeline. She did mention the issue of protection, which I know is also something that you are quite keen to talk about, but just over to you. Is Dalibor still there with us?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can. Go ahead.
Apologies. Thank you, Fifi. I think there's a number of very important points that were raised. Let me start with the Honorable Minister's point, which is one of my big topics, which is that she said that data is the new oil, which means that we all need to use it, right? It's not something which is exclusive for governments or for some companies. We all have to become part of a market with this data. And I think this is very important because a number of nations are realizing that there are lots of things are happening at the global level, but ideally we want to be making it part in South Africa of the South African economy. We want to make sure that the data that's generated by South African people and South African companies can be best utilized in South Africa, ideally. So I was part in a similar project in Turkey with Turkcell, which I think made it one of the most successful projects like this of a digital transformation of a telecom company, which was driven exactly by this idea. Let's go and try to build a national data company which will focus on the best use of the data nationally. It doesn't mean banning the others. It means putting an initiative in this, because as we progress with this digital economy, we would like to, I think what we will see, and I call it digitex economy, we would like to see small entrepreneurs, businesses, restaurants, hairdressers, whatever, to get as much data about their customers as possible so that they can improve their efficiency and improve their service and customize the service. This new economy is about customization. Everyone gets exactly what they want, and for that we need the data. The risk of data concentration with big companies and potentially big foreign companies is that they don't run the agenda how it is used. So I think it is very important to have innovative projects locally that would create this market for data, and that will involve as many local businesses as possible. Because I know that lots of companies will tell you, we come to South Africa, we'll invest and we'll create jobs, we'll do this. But the fact is that we need to create these jobs on a very large scale. So, and it's my belief, I know that some people may disagree and they say that this digital economy will overthrow everything. I think that digital economy will grow, but the existing economy is still dominant, right? The digital economy grows into it and will drive the growth. So what is important is that the digital economy allows, or the data allow to shape the existing economy in the right direction, rather than competing and killing it or completely disrupting it. So I think that's one important point. Just one point about policy, and it goes back to the funding. I remember the word bankable was used a lot in the initial in the opening session. I think the key thing that the policymakers can do or should do to attract funding is to come out with a vision. That's why we produced a document. I put it on the chat as well, if for whoever is interested in, or I can share it in other ways. Because I've worked with governments, I've worked with companies, also from the telecommunications industry, and the problem that I come across in many markets, and I think was quite similar in South Africa, that the different stakeholders have different interests, and they don't believe that there is a long-term vision, or they don't believe in that. They don't find it credible. They think that things can change, and therefore they focus on their short-term interests. And I think spectrum is exactly the right example to show where if there is a longer-term consensus around how the digital economy can work, you can go to the big players and try to get some concessions from them, or I would say not compromise, because compromise is a wrong thing. I mean, you can compromise and get the solution. It's not good for anyone. So let's use the word consensus, where you have a debate and you convince the parties that certain things that you're proposing are actually good for them in the long term, and they should consider this. So that kind of debate, I think, is very important. I've got a couple of other things, but let me pause here and pass the word to other panelists for now. Hello?
You're on mute, Fifi.
We cannot hear.
Apologies there. Thanks so much. Is everyone able to hear me?
Well, now we are.
Fantastic. Yes. Professor Armstrong there nodding very positively to say that I am audible, and I'm going to hand it over to you then. So just to, just feed off what has been shared so far, but most importantly, as the Minister did introduce the various initiatives that we do have on the go, what your thoughts are and how best to action them.
Thanks, Fifi. I think the sort of the mental framework I always use to assess the strategy and digital strategy is, if we think about digital inclusion, most researchers and I agree, digital inclusion rests on three simultaneous necessary things we have to get right. We have to provide access, we have to promote usage, and access and usage has to translate into benefit and impact in communities. So if we think about those three levels, I actually think we're doing much better in access now than we were a while ago. And I think a lot of the measures that have been proposed, for example, the release of spectrum, will also take access a step further forward. What Andile was talking about in terms of the infrastructure to the rest of the world, it makes us have access to the digital infrastructure on a global scale. The one point I would say, and I'm looking forward to seeing the how should we say, the strings attached to the release of the spectrum. Because we live, there's a lot of talk about, we live in this age of abundance where everything's abundant. And that's quite fashionable, but the reality is spectrum is a very scarce resource, and it is therefore incredibly valuable. And I know universal service obligations are sort of a bit outdated and out of fashion and so on. But I think the release of spectrum we need to use that lever to try and alter the industry structure. And I think the industry structure that we're looking at, that we need to get, is a more efficient wholesale market for mobile data services. What's interesting is we've seen in the fixed space, with the creation of a relatively efficient wholesale market, how what that's done for fiber deployment. Fiber deployment has blossomed. It's still got, I think we'd all like it to be much more. But the reality in South Africa is that on wireless services, mobile data services, we do not have an efficient wholesale market. And I know there was talk about it with the WOAN and so on, but it will be interesting to see how the release of the spectrum can precipitate or encourage the creation of a more efficient market for wholesale mobile data services, because that will drive innovation. That will drive new entrants into the economy. That will create a lot of scope for stimulation and greater access. If we move on to the second lens I mentioned, which is about usage, I think there are very interesting things that the Minister said that I'd like to pick up on. And she spoke about supporting local supply chains, local upstream activities in the digital economy. And I think that's really to be encouraged. What I would go a bit further. I would say one of the biggest catalysts for change in South Africa to promote usage is the creation of usage ecosystems. And the digitalization of government services by government itself, not only the Department of Communications and Digital Services, but the digitalization of government services from home affairs through to police, through to education, through to every government department, will firstly create critical mass of demand for a digital economy in South Africa, and it will promote adoption of digital services by society. And you always find in digital transformation that you need champions and early, people who really, that are locomotives for that change. And I think government has an incredible opportunity to play a very profound role there. Related to that, I think it's not just the creation of upstream industries for the digital sector, because the ICT sector is about 4% of the South African economy. What we need to do is create digital supply chains for the broader industry and for broader government services, because that will create critical mass in these ecosystems and therefore drive the network effects, which are really important to drive universal digital inclusion. The final point I want to talk about, which we have to, is the Minister also spoke about 11 million learners in South Africa and the issue of skills. Skills is one of the biggest inhibitors of usage, or the lack of skills is one of the biggest inhibitors of usage, or the research suggests. And I think, firstly, clearly there's a lot to be done in the Department of Basic Education and Training. I absolutely accept that post-school education has a lot of work to do in terms of digitalizing. I think there's a sector that often goes unobserved or undiscussed, and that is the basic foundational digital literacy of the broader population. And I think that's not something that we must throw our hands in the air about. I think it is something that firms and big business and small business and government can do very concrete things to improve the digital literacy of their employees. 16 million people are employed in South Africa. If we could get the digital literacy of all of those to where it needs to be, the diffusion effect into society would be profound. And there are very practical things that can be done in that regard as well. So those would be some things I would add on top of maybe the various, I noted actually 7 things the Minister said they were doing, which I think are all absolutely spot on. I would just add those for consideration.
Thanks, Prof. Let's put it back to the Minister. I mean, in terms of digital literacy and skills. Sure, I don't know how many of you guys have been challenged by learning how to, use these various digital platforms to conduct yourself in meetings and share screens as you're doing a presentation online. It has been quite an interesting process to learn one's digital skills. And just I see there is a question coming from the attendees regarding Mr. Ngcaba's slides. Once again, yes, they will be shared to you right after this or as soon as is possible. Minister, I'm hoping that you can just comment on some of the things that the panelists have said in response to the initiatives that government has got underway. It was quite great, Professor Armstrong noting that, quite a lot has been done by the ministry and government, and we have really improved in the areas of access and increasing access. But there were some areas in which I'm hoping that you can comment on. Dr. Ngcaba was speaking about the accelerating strategies to bring more cloud providers on stream. We also heard about wanting a bit more clarity regarding the T's and C's regarding the spectrum rollout, where things are in terms of digitizing government services, and also most importantly the skills, and making sure that the employed, the unemployed, and all the learners have the necessary skills to be relevant in this digital ecosystem that we're trying to build. Minister?
Thank you so much, Fifi. Probably let me start with the last one on the skills. Although we do know that that's the Department of Education, whether basic or higher, that's responsible for that. But because we have an interest of ensuring that that digital society that I spoke about is built, we then commissioned a study through the University of Wits, a study to give us an analysis of the digital skills gap in South Africa. And they produced that, and out of that, we have therefore developed the digital skills strategy for the country, which has been shared with the clusters. And of course, we're working with the two departments that I spoke about. And right now, it's awaiting approval from the National Skills, whatever that's shared by the Deputy President. And once we do that, as I said, it's important because, as I think it was Brian, who was talking to the fact that we need to make sure that we build digital literacy at all levels. There's a high illiteracy rate when it comes to digital skills, but then how do we work together to make sure that everybody then becomes that digital literate that we're talking about? So that's the first thing. And as we do that, the Department of Higher Education, on its own science and innovation, has established a component internally that's looking into the skills of the future. And what is it that is required at what level in terms of the post-matric level, whilst the Department of Basic Education is also working on their own. That's why President made the announcement to say now we'll be seeing learners at a lower level introduced to coding. As I'm talking about that, as the department, we then initiated or launched a program that's called Building a 4IR Capable Army, which seeks to say, we do appreciate you nurses, traditional engineers, traditional presenters and all that, but things are going digital. And what are the key things? And then amongst the programs that we are running there is the one of ensuring that we produce data scientists at different levels, because you do know the entire ecosystem data has to be mined, processed, and all those things. So we introduced that program. We introduced that of the 3D printing, which again is another technology that, as we talk about manufacturing and other things in the new space, is very important. We then introduced again programming and drone piloting. We want to position South Africa as an e-commerce country that can provide the services beyond the southern side of the continent, but into the entire continent if possible. We also introduced software development, amongst others, and e-gaming. Key to that is digital content development. Where do people access content and how? Not everybody will be commissioned by SABC or the other broadcasters, but there's a need, as you see actually every day in your cell phone, you laugh at certain videos that people have not yet learned how to commercialize those, because other countries have really built on that economy. All this talks to the skills and the opportunities that we foresee for South Africa if we were to invest in some of them, as I said earlier. The second one again, which talks to, I think it's Brian or Dalibor, I can't remember, who says it's very important to have a clear vision of where you want to go, not to look at short-term goals, which is something that, again, needs a mind shift of not only government, but the industry itself. Not to want to be selfish, because right now we have invested in this, and therefore every policy and law that must come must be aligned with this that we invested on. Which is why we said it's important that as we try to work on the digital economy master plan, the 4 recommendations in terms of presenting and then making sure that they are implemented, we also have to engage the private sector on their future investment plans, so that as government, we're able to be agile and create policies that will be responsive to them. And that requires all of us working together. It doesn't matter if you policy, because we do not make policies for ourselves as government, which is one of the challenges that we faced in the past. Our policies mainly were inward looking, which is why we said now we've got to look at that matters, what is needed for the country, and therefore who needs to do what and what kind of policy needs to be produced. Dr. Ngcaba introduces an important thing that every time I raise it, people want to kill me, that we really need to have a complete overhaul of the legislations that we have and the regulations. And as much as people think when you talk about this, it's because you want to occupy space, but it is the reality. As he mentioned, the different services that are offered on the platforms, whether it's agri-tech and all that, they all require that thinking that said, what is the kind of future that we envisage? Not to say how we're doing things prior COVID. COVID has shown us flames. How would we then seek to build from this that we have seen, that we may not be able to go to our milli fields, but people have to eat? What therefore do we need to do? Which is why we will be presenting soon the recommendations of the Presidential Commission to the entire cabinet. And once that's adopted, in terms of implementation, that government has to implement, will have to be implemented in an integrated manner. That we have even said as we're working on the economic reform strategy now, to say, let's make sure that all the matters that cut across, was one of the weaknesses again, was that silo mentality. I'm Department of Communications, and people, when they look at me, they think spectrum, nothing else. I'm Department of Agriculture, they just see maize, and they're not looking at the entire ecosystem. And how does it depend on other sectors? So this is what we have learned, and we thank the commissioners also for making sure that they widen the space, the type of energy that we need, the capabilities that are there. So we are hoping that as government, we're going to improve on our planning, because as I said, one thing that we have emphasized with the SIDSSA administration is that of working with people outside government, bringing fresh thoughts, but most importantly, bringing innovators themselves, to an extent that, Fifi, we're now even having discussions on the SCM processes. Does it make sense to want to confine everybody to a specification for a particular service, whereby you can get more services or better innovations if you were to open it up? And of course, because I love hackathons, I always make an example. Just say, I have a challenge in terms of the services that are rendered as social development. We want a particular solution. Why can't we just hold a hackathon? And then we let young people be innovative as they can, and then bring the solutions that they see that South Africa can work on. The last thing, the T's and C's of the spectrum, it is the regulator that is responsible for that. I am hopeful that in the ITA that they'll be issuing, then there will be an indication of what they are looking at. As I said, the Act only limits me to that of issuing the policy and the policy direction. But we are having engagements. As you know, that our Parliament has recently sent the list to the Minister of the people that are nominated to serve in the regulation, and we will be writing back to the Speaker to say these are the people that we recommend for appointment. Thank you for now, Fifi.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, can I actually just ask you just once again to comment on the regulatory changes that you say that, you know, you have been saying for the longest of time that things do need to change and become more relevant to the current times. You're going to Parliament, you have said, and that matter will be discussed, but how long then after till we get to the finish line of implementation? Because that often is the problem with our policy and our regulatory frameworks. I don't want to be sitting here with you, Minister, 2-3 years from now and talking about the implementation of policies that you have mentioned to us now in 2020. So if you can just give us some timelines there.
Thank you, Fifi. We are hopeful that if we get buy-in in everything that's entailed in the Presidential Commission, we'll be able to get people to understand that lawmaking process, to say there's a need for us to review the process that we take, as I spoke about agility, because that's one thing that we really need to focus on. In this era that we are in, what kind of a lawmaker do we require? The one that must appreciate the environment that we are participating in. Same applies to the regulator. I said earlier when I was making the correction on telecoms, because everything that we've been doing has been looking at that, even at regulatory level. How would we then make sure that we have regulators that appreciate that the internet is the driver of things, everything that is happening, and therefore they have to understand the basics of internet, the socio-economic impact of internet themselves, so that when they go and regulate, they do not prohibit innovation. They do not issue a regulation 2 years later, as we have just said, and it's no longer relevant. So we are trying to have those engagements, but key to that is that skills provision that we spoke about, because for people to understand, they really have to be taken through a process to say, this is where you want to go, which is why I linked the skills program with what Dalibor spoke about, the importance of a shared vision. Because if you're going to have a regulator or a policymaker that has a particular vision, or an industry that has a particular vision in terms of where do they want to take South Africa, and that's not shared in the entire legislative framework, then you're not going to achieve that. Now, what's important is for all of us to come together, which is what is an opportunity that was presented by the Presidential Commission to say, bring everyone who are experts in different sectors, let them discuss the future of South Africa in the fourth industrial revolution era, and therefore help them guide us, and then we see, because we can't continue with that process of making a legislation 18 months. We cannot. Because by the time we come after 18 months, which is why we need to go out and appeal to the public and the interested stakeholders, because at times delays are not only from government level, delays are also at those that have interest that will take the process to court and delay. So that importance of that vision that is shared is very important that we all mobilize towards. I will pause there for now, Fifi.
Thanks so much, Minister. Regulation that doesn't inhibit innovation. I like that. So I'm gonna steal that phrase. Thank you. If we could just hone in on the T's and C's of spectrum. And Minister, I'm just doing this just to give you an opportunity, perhaps as the middleman in this position between CASA and us, just hearing what some of the panelists are saying around the spectrum and perhaps how better it could be rolled out to achieve its aims. Dr. Andile, we were speaking last night, and you were giving your views around this, and I thought that you could just...
Are you sure you want me to express my views?
I want them so that the minister can take them on board. You know, she is not one to expressing her.
Fifi, can I make a proposal before Dr. Ngcaba? Before he comes in, Dr. Ngcaba is one of the people who authored the legislations that we have, who set out how regulatory frameworks must be done. So as he'll be asking the questions, he must then talk to how do we then change that he has put in place, that I am implementing currently, as I'm talking about the need for a complete overhaul of all these things that are delaying us, including the role of the shareholder or the policymaker in the spectrum licensing process.
Well, Minister, thank you very much. Thank you, Fifi. Thanks, colleagues. I wanted to remind Brian in a meeting we had at CSIR, I think it was probably 1995 or 94, Minister, or just before that. And he was looking much younger than he is now as a young scientist at CSIR. And at that time, we were discussing the birth of mobile. And Telkom at the time said that no, mobile will be 10% of connectivity in South Africa. And what do we see today? I mean, if you look at the share price of Telkom, and if I was the shareholder of Telkom, I would have long sold Telkom to the market. So that's really, I mean, that's just one example of a phase change. I think, Minister, if I was in your shoes, I would close down ICASA and start a new digital regulator and literally ask everybody to go home and basically do away with the law. I wrote that law in 2002, and it's so outdated. It's not something that you can drive digital transformation of a country with. I would honestly say that close this organization, let everybody go and reskill and write a new digital regulator basically in the country. That's what I would do. Now, coming to the issue of spectrum. This is a very overrated piece of technology, and it's outdated and overrated. If I ask you a question today, who are the top 10 largest companies in the world by market cap? There's not been a single company that is a mobile operator. Mobile operators are doomed to die like the way in which fixed telcos died. I give them no less than 10 years, basically. I said in 2000 and just before the World Cup that in 2017, voice as we know it and the interconnect regime and that whole model that we designed again will come to an end and people will use the internet to communicate. There are still people clinging on to the old model of interconnect regime, which is moribund and which has long dead, which needs to be removed from the statutes of laws in our country and regulations. That is why I'm saying that needs to be changed. Colleagues, I mean, the issue basically of digital transformation, it requires bold decisions, extremely bold decisions. Even if you do them in an enterprise, there will be those people who don't want to change, who want to keep the old way of doing things. And what do you do in an organization when you want to change and create a digital bank or a digital company or an e-commerce company? You actually have to do something quite drastic. If you are going to do something cosmetic, it's not going to change. When we changed the laws in the early 90s, between 1994 to 2002, we had to change laws which were apartheid laws. Not only that they were apartheid, they were old analog and digital laws. These laws have been running for over 20 years or so for now. And I really think that, I mean, unless we take a very bold decision as a country on these issues, we will really not go anywhere. The issue, as far as I'm concerned, if I would advise any young person today, I would say build a tech company, a software-driven company, a cloud company that is global in nature. To give an example, in the last 2 months, we built a platform called combatcovid.africa. Today, we are in more than 300 cities in the world. We are in more than 44 countries. This is a platform built here in this country and is being used by people everywhere in the continent, right? Mobile communications has a location-based environment which makes it very rigid to operate. As a country, we cannot define our strategy based on spectrum and mobile. If we want to build a digital strategy, we have to think about ourselves becoming a global country whereby we basically provide services to 7 billion people in the world. We create companies like Alibaba, we create companies like Google, like AWS. This is what the world is today. It's about having 100 million clients. It's about having 1 billion clients in your platform. So South Africans, they have capability, they have knowledge. We really need to move away from this way of looking at digital as if it is spectrum. Digital is not spectrum. In fact, we should not even auction spectrum. We should give spectrum for free to people to use in order to address that digital divide that people talked about. Honestly, the issue of auction, Minister, I think in my view, it's honestly a waste of time and money for the state. Rather, put serious obligations to those who are given spectrum to do what is right for the country in terms of taking us to that digital society. Taking money, 2 or 3 billion to put in the fiscus, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to make any change. I really think that we need to make bold decisions as a country when it comes to digital. If you realize the language that is being discussed today in the continent, people are talking about other countries. I mean, I'm not going to mention them by name that are starting to be ahead of us. We have no time, colleagues. Countries compete. If we cannot tackle this in a highly competitive way, we are going to be left behind. Close the regulator, start a new body, and create a digital regulator in the country with skills of people who are going to be enablers, not regulators, or a process that is going to take 9 months. These processes that take 9 months, we legislated them in 1994. It's 2020. We cannot apply these laws and regulations. They cannot work. They're not going to take us anywhere.
As I wonder if we have any attendees on the call working at ICASA thinking, what are you saying? But Minister, quite revolutionary thoughts there coming from Dr. Ngcaba, and I'm wondering if you'd like to respond to them now, or you want some time just to perhaps digest on ideas of closing down the regulator completely and setting up something new, and also doing away with the spectrum auction process, as it is a waste of taxpayers' money, as was communicated. Would you like to respond now, or shall I give you a bit of time?
Let me respond now, Fifi.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Okay. Dr. Ngcaba seems to be reading from the same script. The reason I said let him be the person who responds, and I said this is what I'm implementing because of what he initiated, is because I find myself having to implement all these traditional things I'm against. But the nice thing about the South African way of doing things is that democracy and that respect of all the existing structures that must adhere to the law in front of them has to be respected and to be given. For example, if you have noticed, I had taken time on the ICASA appointments, even sending the letter to Parliament to say go with the process, because I was saying there's a need for us to review, including the number of the existing councillors and the skills thereof. And because the challenge that we face with now, as we go implement what Dr. Ngcaba had written and prescribed for this country, we want to be stuck in it. We're not looking into what the future requires. If you were to go and look at the caliber of people that we are looking at, the candidates and all that, you'll find that very few will be responsive to this that we're talking about. And that's the reality that we are faced with as the country this time. People can choose to make it a minister's thing, but it is the challenge that we seem to be saying this without understanding what is required for us to achieve this that we're talking about. The second thing, on the auctioning of the spectrum, unfortunately, as a country, we're not doing very well, Dr. Ngcaba. Otherwise, trust me, we do agree that we should be providing spectrum in a manner that's going to benefit most people and therefore enable the environment that we want to build, which is one of the things, again, that we created, that we have not even looked at spectrum at a security angle level, but we've looked at it as an economic thing, a once-off, not looking to the entire ecosystem of the spectrum, which requires a debate again amongst ourselves, not only the policymaker, because I said earlier, it is this country that has a tendency of delaying processes by taking each other to court because people have invested in certain components of the ecosystem. That's why I liked that Dalibor spoke about, the importance of a shared vision, so that people can then find expression to say, we all have a role to play and we'll all benefit without being selfish to say it belongs to me. Thirdly, when we issued the policy direction and the policy in July, we were expecting an engagement. We had several engagements with different stakeholders, but again, the engagements and the consultations that we had was with the people who are only interested in the telcos. We didn't look at the people. We didn't bring everybody in the spectrum ecosystem, which is what takes us back. As we continue to talk about spectrum that's going to enable economic growth, how is it going to do that? Because for as long as we do not unpack that, we're not going to be able to then, let's say, invest in these areas. If you are saying spectrum is going to enable. Yes, for connectivity, it's going to be there and all that. But what is it that happens when people are connected? What kind of services that people must access, and what applications that must create new jobs when they're leveraging on the spectrum, let alone that this is the spectrum, as Dr. Ngcaba said, that is with the telcos. So I'm throwing it back because this is a roundtable with a group of panelists that must then, as we make these proposals, if they agree, We must work together in canvassing for these ideas for the betterment of South Africa to occupy its rightful place in the fourth industrial revolution. It must stop being a policymaker thing or a government thing, because it doesn't benefit government only. And as we know how we operate in South Africa, we're great lobbyists. So as we do that lobbying, let's make sure that the lobbying at least addresses the futuristic benefits, not just short-term gains that we see today because the banks, we can't go to fintech because we're comfortable with the traditional ways. I always put it like this, and most people hate me for it, to say, my job is to disrupt the system. I'm not here to confirm. I'm going to make people uncomfortable. But unfortunately, if as I do that, people don't understand that when I say the department that I'm working with, but we are there to disrupt the status quo. But if the people that we're disrupting for do not have an appreciation of that, again, the courts emerge and all the other processes that we see, which is why it requires all of us, the kind of judiciary that must appreciate when we say we want the interpretation of the law, this is the environment that we're participating in. The good argument that all the panelists have been making, this is not about ICTs. This is about changing the economy and building a new economy that all South Africans must benefit from. I'm throwing it back, Fifi, to the panelists to say, with all the attendees there, what is good for South Africa as we're marching towards December that I spoke about, issuing the spectrum on 4G, and as we're preparing for the future. We said we don't want to be a policymaker that's inward looking. We want the role players to say, this is how you can create an enabling environment government. And we are a listening government. Over to you, Fifi and Dr. Nalo.
Thank you. Thanks so much to the rest of the panelists and or to the minister. And I hope the rest of the panelists are ready to take what the minister has just thrown our way. Dalibor, I want to bring you in here because I do know, I mean, in your work, consulting, spectrum does come up, and you did mention spectrum at the start of your introductory remarks. So perhaps maybe you can give us a bit of insights into how, I mean, does the spectrum enable this economic growth that we're talking about and this inclusive economic growth? The minister's asking, and then we'll also hand it over to Prof. Brian Armstrong. Dalibor, before you answer the issue of spectrum, one of the attendees is wanting to know how they get access to your research that you did mention at the start. So perhaps you can.
I put it in the chat, and I can email it as well to you after this, if that helps.
That would be perfect.
Okay, so look, there are lots of very interesting points and perhaps a little bit aggressive points, but I think it's good that we're making those, because I cannot agree more with the Honourable Minister when she says that the debate needs more stakeholders. I've worked like that in other countries, and I can tell you that it's a long way, long journey. There's a lot of silos within the telecom industry, which are quite powerful, and but also elsewhere. And to get the stakeholders on the table, the industrial companies, the ones who don't even know that they will need these private 5G networks, to actually realize what they may need in 5 years' time, and how the spectrum decisions that will determine their future can play out is really, really important. But I'd like to maybe mention another slightly provocative point here. You know, lots of countries quite rightly want to compete and want to develop the digital markets, but I think we have to think about the consumer a little bit, right? We have to think about that we're not here to dictate how people's future will look like. It's the people and the businesses and the consumer who will determine how the future will look like. We may think that these digital technologies will be very helpful, and there's a lot of reasons to be positive about this, but we should not be forgetting that the driver of this should be in consumer demands, or people actually wanting these things, rather than these things being pushed on them by the policymakers. So I think it's very important then to think about who will be creating these things, who will be going to the marketplace and maybe failing with some products and succeeding with others. And you know, as it was said here, I mean, there's of course this idea that we can make South Africa another Silicon Valley, another kind of global hub. And I suppose it's always good to have aspirations. But as I work in a couple of countries, there's also has to be some degree of realism in terms of what the government can do and what the consumers will want and what the consumers at this stage will most appreciate. That's why some countries may be pushing back a little bit on certain things so that they can address things that are more important. Like what you mentioned, Fifi, if there is an issue with 2G coverage, we probably want to address these rural issues. We want to address this digital divide, and it may be a priority over some other things that would be nice to have and not nice to build. And I know that there is going to be a debate, and different stakeholders will have different views on that. I think in terms of what is realistic, I would say three things. What does the consumer want? What are the big industries that are involved right now, and they may actually form some bottlenecks in this all? And I'm not referring only to the telecoms industry, by the way, but also the big tech industries. The data platform markets are very concentrated globally. And is that good? Is that something that maybe at some point may be creating some market power issues? As you know, the European Commission is looking at this now. They're reviewing the legislation for Europe on that regard. There's a lot of discussion about the market concentration on the equipment market with some vendors that are deemed as risky, and there's not many others that can replace them, and etc. So there's a lot of things. But let me get straight to one point that I wanted to make. I know that maybe two speakers made a point about reforming telecoms, and the Honorable Minister mentioned the aggressive rethink of everything, which I'm fully subscribing to. That's what I'm doing. I'm trying to provide input in this aggressive rethink. But again, the implementation is important, and it's important to see what can work and what is realistic and what is not. And there's one idea that's been flagged in South Africa, which is let's make all the network wholesale open access. I'm working on some projects like this, and I think it's good if it also comes from the industry and that it comes from a debate with the industry, if it's not like a fight between a strong industry that can block it and other stakeholders who want this. I think there's a number of, and there's a lot of positive signs that the communication industry may be moving in globally in towards more accommodative position towards these things. But we've got to discuss, and we actually really need to say, what do we want? It's sometimes a risk that the people come from academia that I've seen in other countries and say, if I had a blank sheet of paper, this is what I would do. And let's just review everything. And then usually the plan that comes out of this is not executable. I think what works for us now, if we want to reform and we want wholesale, there is COVID-19, there is environmental agenda, which means that excessive overlapping infrastructures would consume more energy, would be less efficient. There is health agenda. Some people don't like the too many antennas. There's a debate whether they should be or should not be concerned. Nonetheless, if there is a reason to make things more efficiently, that could make sense. So there's a lot of things which we can, a lot of trends, and I would say also in the tech and telecoms industry, if you look at those around the world, which could make us think maybe now is the right moment for this reform. But let's start discussing what is realistic. We cannot just say that we come with a blank sheet of paper and just redesign everything and make the country a Silicon Valley and every problem will be solved, because I don't think it's that simple.
Certainly, Dalibor, don't be too uncomfortable, not to aggressive conversation, more robust, which is fantastic for a panel, because we're here to seek solutions and we're here to really discuss ways to get this right, because we don't have time to make any unnecessary delays or errors. Prof. Brian, to bring it back to you, I mean, you were talking about you're interested to see what the T's and C's of spectrum allocation is going to look like. Perhaps maybe some input from you on the kinds of T's and C's you'd like to be unveiled from that when ICASA does finally give us clarity on that.
In a sense, I feel a bit embarrassed that I sort of raised the issue of spectrum, the release of the spectrum. And I think I would, notwithstanding robust debate and the fact that robust debate is good, for me, the issue isn't actually the process of the release of spectrum. For me, the issue is a progressive transformation of the industry structure. And the release of spectrum, I raise it in the context that it can be a trigger or a catalyst in the progressive evolution of the industry structure or the market structure in South Africa. And I agree we don't have a blank sheet of paper. And the reality is the two big mobile operators, but also Telkom and the other operators, have a really important part to play, that whatever we think we want to do, notwithstanding the fact that their share price is in the doldrums, they still have the executional capacity to do what has to be done. There is this big debate. I mean, certainly the Famgas and the Alibabas and the Tencents, 7 of the top 10 of the world's most valuable companies, the platform businesses, the investors love them. But the reality, as we heard this morning, is certainly in other sectors, investors also like infrastructure projects. So what we need to do is find a way that we can put some infrastructure projects on the table that attract investors, that the big players in South Africa, plus opportunity for new entrants, can find a way to make infrastructure available that the over-the-top players can play on top of. Because although they are the sexy ones, they attract all the investment value, they still run on the networks and the infrastructure that the unfashionable telcos provide. And we need to be careful that we don't kill the goose that's laying the golden egg, or that we've got to have a balanced ecosystem, that we've got infrastructure, but we have the enabling environment with the appropriate regulatory frameworks, the appropriate oversight, the appropriate content businesses, and the appropriate South African, indigenous African platform businesses that can thrive on top of that. That's what we have to get right and create all those enabling conditions. Oh, and by the way, spectrum is a necessary step on the way. So I don't want to get too hooked up on the whole issue of the release of spectrum. Let's get it done with, and let's use that as one of the levers to play in restructuring the industry. Maybe on a completely different tangent, the minister mentioned the issue of content. We need to be, I mean, there's all sorts, we'll talk about pathways for sustainable growth and how, because what is important is how ICT and digital is an enabler of the broader economy to create pathways for sustainable growth in the broader sense. But within the digital context, I mean, the fact is, the reality of global internet content, that is 99% of global content is not in indigenous African languages. And we need to find a way to improve the usability of that by the majority of our population. And I think a strong push, while I support this idea of a strong content push about the creation of digital content that is, on the one hand, in indigenous languages. On the other hand, a strong push into translation technologies that, even if it's not in an indigenous language, that people who are not particularly comfortable in English can access it and get value out of it. And thirdly, of course, there is the basic education issue of language proficiency of South Africa. So that's, I think, I mean, while we were on these sort of enabling conditions, I wanted to touch on that. But maybe to say, if we therefore, let's all accept the position that it's not, digital itself is the means to the end. It is the means to empowering South Africans and enabling South Africa's economy to find sustainable pathways to growth. And there's a lot of work that's been done on that. And I think it is important maybe just to recap some of the ideas that have come out of it. How do we create a vibrant market for digitally traded services? We used to call it business process outsourcing, but there's a much bigger opportunity around globally traded digital services. The second is, how do we create, what are the enabling conditions that will allow South Africa to be a hub as a frontier for the piloting and the exploration of technologies in an emerging markets context? Thirdly, what new labor-absorbing, everybody talks about Uber and Airbnb and wow, and they've created a lot of jobs. What other labor-absorbing platforms can we create that will lead to hundreds of thousands of jobs being created? Digital is key to that. How do we create smarter, how do we unlock the power of digital to create smart agriculture, which can really provide the exports which pay for a lot of the stuff? How do we digitalize domestic consumption? I think COVID is actually ironically going to accelerate the digitalization of domestic consumption and expenditure. And finally, there is the issue of manufacturing. And that's the one where I personally am a bit less bullish, because globally, growth in manufacturing capacity is exceeding growth in demand for manufactured goods. So we need to be a little bit careful that we don't, I mean, I think there's absolutely niches that we can and should play, and we need to be careful of the concentration. And I think concentration offers an opportunity for niche players with emphasized local demand conditions to play. But I think manufacturing, we've got to be very razor sharp on the areas that we invest.
Fifi, before Minister closes, can I request to say something?
Can I ask that you be brief? We've got a lot of comments coming from the attendees, and I want to make sure I give everyone a chance. So fire away.
I was going to close. Sorry. Can I say this? I'm sorry to come in. Let me explain to you, I'll be very short if you don't worry. The structure of 5G is cloud native, meaning it's born in the cloud, the way the design and the environment. So the way in which you look at this as a network, it will be totally wrong. I mean, let me give you one example. By 2024, 25, right, you won't even know the mobile operator that you belong to. You will use communications basically not by being associated with a mobile operator. You will use communications by being on the internet, right? That's what basically is going to happen. It's going to be packaged differently. So this monolithic way of looking at telco in the way that we did 20 years ago is coming to an end in the next 3 to 4 years. I give you an example. Google a company called Jio in India. And this company, how in less than 5 years, it grew from 0 to over 300 million clients, having beaten Bharti and Vodafone, okay? This is what is defined as a new type of business. And you don't pay for calls and ask them, how do they make money? I will tell you another day. But my last comment is the following, is that, you see, if you look at, I'll give you an example. I mean, I want to pick up what the minister said, right? Why I want to repeat that. When we were writing the green paper in this country and the white paper at the beginning, we did talk about post-ICASA period, that there will come a time where in a paper that we published called Info.com 2025, we talked about a post-ICASA, that there will come a time where we don't need this and we will need something much more digital. Right? Now, to conclude my statement, the issue of fintech sits in the Payment Act that sits in the Reserve Bank and Treasury. Insurtech, right, sits somewhere else, right? Envirotech, cleantech, edutech, all these, there's no way whereby the current ICASA can do enablement of all these digital environments. I don't think this is about, doing everything. We really have no choice. If we want this country to go ahead, we have to close down some institutions and build new ones. And honestly, it is not something that does not respect the jobs, but the runway of ICASA in this current form has come to an end.
Can I say a quick thing?
Dalibor, I'll give it to you now in just a moment. Perhaps if I could just get to some of the attendees, because they have really been making quite a number of remarks, and just to also present to you as the panelists what people are saying about some of your ideas. There's an issue, there's a comment that has been made regarding access and the improvements in access that we have seen so far, however, noting that there's still some challenges, particularly in the access to education and online learning. And that's speaking to the various levels of connectivity and affordability on that regard. Minister, there's also a question to you, or a comment to you, more so around the mobile network operators and the allocation of the additional spectrum, helping them to be a lot more efficient. And I don't know, perhaps that person not taking the view of Dr. Ngcaba there, that 10 years from now, we might not have them listed on the JSE. Dr. Ngcaba, in fact, we've got a few comments regarding some of the things that you have been saying, agreeing with your revolutionary remarks, saying government does require a technology platform to improve service delivery. Minister, again, to your point around collaboration and emphasizing the importance of collaboration in industry and stakeholder engagement, saying that, or giving that approach rather a thumbs up, saying that the country cannot, or it is our journey as a country rather than government only. And just again, Minister, some thumbs up given to the timelines that you have given around the issuance of some of ICASA spectrum, the December 2020 plan that you did mention. We'd have clarity on. There's a lot of approval and relief regarding that. But there's a question regarding clarity on the DTT migration, which you did say would be released in 2021. So perhaps, Minister, if you can just provide the clarity on DTT migration before we take this conversation home, and raise something that I actually think is quite important right now, given what is going on regarding jobs, and also what Dr. Ngcaba is saying regarding ICASA potentially closing down. Addressing the jobs issue. But Minister, before you do that, just clarity on the timelines for the DTT migration.
Thank you so much, Fifi. I did say we are out of time. The DTT program was started long time ago. I mean, like, it's more than 10 years we've been talking about. We come and change models and all that, until the last time that we said, let's then make sure that we're inclusive in terms of the technologies that are currently available. Let's then go for, as I said, for the subsidized market, because this is where government comes in. So the reason we are also looking at the subsidized market, there are lots of people that are going to be migrated are the unsubsidized, which is why I said, once ICASA finalizes all of those processes, which they've issued standards on, to say the manufacturers can go ahead and manufacture the devices, so that the unsubsidized market can go and buy those at the available retailers closer to them. But for the subsidized market, that's where we said, because what we have discovered as we've been supplying or providing set-top boxes, we discovered that we identify a family that qualifies, but they do not have a TV. And in the qualifying criteria, it was said that it must be a TV-owning household, below 3,200 and all that. But what happens when they can't even afford that TV? Which is one of the things that we said, anyway, there's IDTVs that are there. Therefore, rather government subsidize a portion towards the provision of IDTVs. Then I spoke about 2021 as the complete switch off period. I would like to say December switch off, but I will not be practical. The reason I'm raising this, when we had engagements with OEMs whom have been left out of the discussion when we talk about the digital migration in most cases, because it has been the mobile operators, the broadcast, and the contract manufacturers at times, actually, they were saying it's the first time that they were engaged, because we wanted to understand the capability of the manufacturers to say how many devices can you then manufacture a year, so that when we say we're switching off in December, indeed people, those that have money, can buy and have it. And upon engagement, it was clear that it can't be done this year. So that's why we said, okay, let's then extend the period to next year, and we make sure that those that are unsubsidized, they go ahead and buy and buy from the market, whilst we are working on the subsidized market. And as I said, ICASA has already issued the standards in relation to that. You will see that we have not been big on awareness, which is something people have been talking about. The reason we have not gone very radical on awareness was we should be able, when we drive our communication strategy, we should be able to say, you as FIFI seated in Sandhurst, this is what you can do and this is where you can get it. And then we say to the one that is seated at Kunusa cannot afford, or somewhere in a township, we say, this is where you can go and this is what you must do. So we needed to bring all those components together so that when we give out an awareness, it's one message, because we can't afford to come up with a communication strategy that talks to the subsidized and talks to the unsubsidized. We will not be coherent and we will not be practical. And this is what I say has led to all the delays, let alone the chopping and changing of the policies, but not being practical about what that we can produce in this country. So that's why I'm saying at least latest we've agreed by next year, because the manufacturers have made a commitment that, Minister, if the standards are issued and then you help us on awareness, even for those that are not subsidized, we have no reason not to produce more. Because currently, as I'm speaking to you, the numbers that we could gather as we called all the manufacturers, it was not even beyond 100 million that we could get. It was 150,000 on others and this. And then that's when I said, if we say in December, we are lying, and then the public will be asking us again. And we can't afford to do that. That's why I say it's important to look into the entire ecosystem of this, that as we put the timelines and the policies, are they practical, or what is it that we need to do as government to make sure that we enhance the capabilities of the existing companies in order to be able to meet the demand of that we want to achieve. We can be rhetoric about it or theorize it, speak because we have a pressure of spectrum, but people are not gonna be migrated by December. That's the reality if you go to the ground. So that's why I can't say December this year, because we've engaged with the people who must produce the device, as I said, both for subsidized market and unsubsidized market.
Thanks, Minister. Just another question for you, if you don't mind. Sandhurst, wow, Minister, I love the prophecy that you're speaking there. From your lips to God's ears, from your lips to God's ears. But going to, or joke aside rather, there's a question from the private sector really asking what is needed from the private sector to help grow this sector.
What is needed for the private sector to do what? Sorry, Fifi, I didn't get that.
What is needed? What is government looking for from the private sector to help grow? If it's rands and cents, how much money are we looking for? If it's other skills or capabilities, what is government looking for exactly? Or it looks like an individual from one of the leading banks is wanting clarity.
We need about 5.2 billion, of which in the allocation we have 1.6 between this year and next year, and Cabinet has given us the go-ahead to go and look for funding. That's why I said when I spoke here, when I spoke about broadband, and then I said also DTT, I'm hoping that there'll be people who are looking at investing in it. I do know that the private sector, especially the mobile operators, have said, Minister, you can just give us spectrum and then you let us do it and all that. But it's also important, as much as other people don't agree with the obligations that we impose, it's important that we look at how is this going to affect the value of that auction. Because if we're saying we're providing spectrum, we do not have time frames, the spectrum is not available, we can't even afford it, and then it has other implications. Which is why we said, as Cabinet said, you can borrow against spectrum as long as you work with Treasury on that to say this is what you can get. We're exploring all other means. We have a DMAC, which is an advisory body that's inclusive of mobile operators, broadcast, and other stakeholders, to say how do we bring in the industry together to say this is what we can do in order to fast track the process. But right now, for the subsidized market, it's only the monetary that we're looking at. But for the unsubsidized market, we were looking at the standards that must be issued for the manufacturers to produce the devices that are needed.
And then one more, Minister, and you have mentioned this, you did raise it, and perhaps your response will be brief because you've mentioned something to this regard, but there was just a question around SA Connect and ensuring that connectivity does actually reach all the parties, particularly those in the deep rural areas, because there's a sentiment and a feeling on the ground that SA Connect is only earmarked for government buildings without general access.
That is true, Fifi. The existing policy of SA Connect was designed like that, which is what we have spoken to the DG and the team to say, let's review, because we need to provide wall-to-wall connectivity. We made an example that look at COVID right now, that you may have connected public buildings, but people will not be able to go to those buildings. Therefore, there's a need for us to look beyond government buildings. And as I'm speaking to you, I said the IDC is working on those with the team from the department. Therefore, they're now looking at the broader connectivity, which is something that can be driven by government. And I want to emphasize this. This is why we are saying it's very important that we work with the private sector, but come up with incentives so that when they go to the areas that are not profit making, they do not provide proper quality in terms of connectivity. Because we've seen poor quality, we want people who are seated in my village, Sakela, be able to enjoy the same service with people that are seated in Hyde Park. Because it doesn't mean that because I'm from Sakela, I can't be innovative as a person in Hyde Park. Therefore, the amount of capability in terms of connectivity that I would require will be the same. But how do we then incentivize private sector that, as we have seen even in the past, they've been concentrated in the areas where they make profit. You only see it now, them going to the townships. I guess it's because it's the issue of owning infrastructure, because anyway, people are getting connected. But if you go to the rural areas, very few people that are going there. So we want to make it a responsibility for all to say that people in the rural areas deserve the same quality of service like those that are in Hyde Park.
Thank you, Minister. I'd like to bring the rest of the panel back into the conversation as we do go into concluding remarks. Wow, I'd never realized 2 hours can go by so quickly, but we are left with around 10 minutes to have this discussion. And Dalibor, before I rudely interrupted you, apologies for that. Please, just take it away. Just take it away and just comment on some of the things that you wanted to raise initially.
To express, to answer these questions, I understand. Look, I think one of the central points of these debates was what's going to happen with the telecoms industry, right? That there was this suggestion that it won't exist even, and then all these things. I think it's important to look a little bit at the history. So these wireless operators were created worldwide in the 1980s and 1990s. I think it started in America, if I remember correctly. And that was a decision of the policymakers. They decided that for some reason it would be appropriate to create 2, 3, or 4 companies to allocate this spectrum nationwide. Initially it was done, for example, in Europe against some, they call it beauty contests, some obligations, not even much money paid for the spectrum. I'd like to emphasize again that this was created, these companies were created by the policymakers. It was not Bill Gates or Carl Benz, or actually Alexander Graham Bell was the last kind of inventor in this industry almost 2 centuries ago, right? So these are companies that were created to facilitate something, to build these networks at the time of huge liberalism, when the thought was that if you build 3, 4 networks, it would somehow be better than if you build 1. And it was a great success in the 1990s. In 1995, GSMA was set up as an association of these operators and became a very powerful global group. And just one small correction, when the comparison was made about the size of the tech companies and Google's and the telecoms, suggesting that the telecoms are not big enough, they are still bigger. I mean, you cannot compare, I don't know, MTN in South Africa with Google globally, right? It's you have to sort of compare like alike. So despite the growth and momentum and the greatness of the business model of the tech companies, if you actually look at their revenue from each country, it's not like that the telecoms is a fraction of it. It may be the other way around. But I do actually agree with the point that this model has to be reformed. And I think more and more of the visionary telecom companies are beginning to see this as well and beginning to agree with this notion as well. And it's just because the economics of 5G will be different and this new generation. And I agree with the previous speakers on this as well. I don't have time to outline the models, but we do have models, and they are being thought about. They are being applied by some of these companies, or at least in early stages. There obviously has to be some thought about how much you want to deeply share or even monopolize some of the infrastructure, and how much of a new market they may emerge around regulated, nationally protected data. These are new things. I don't want to. We don't have time probably to go through how this may work, but I can assure you that it can be done in a way that will be beneficial both for the telecom operators and the stakeholders. The telecom operators will move more towards the regulated data market. The infrastructure will be more deeply shared. The question is, what do you do with the spectrum? And then you can also create the OTT, the unregulated data market on the top of it. This is something that I deeply believe that it needs to be discussed before any major decisions are made, because that business model, I agree, has to be changed. But we cannot look at it from one point of view only.
All right, certainly. Dalibor, I believe that this is just, the start of the engagements on growing our digital ecosystem. And for sure, you'll have the opportunity to engage further and give us more detail on your ideas. Well, to the rest of the South Africans on the panel, before we get to the minister, of course, we've got around 6 minutes left for this discussion, and rationing of things I know is something that South Africans have gotten used to, from water rationing to electricity rationing. So I'm going to ask you to ration your time, Dr. Andile and Prof. Armstrong, between yourselves. Concluding remarks, if you could just make them as brief as possible. 2 minutes would be great. Dr. Andile.
No, let Prof go for it.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Fifi. I think there was a question I'd like to quickly touch on about difficulty in accessing educational content. The issue there is most of the mobile operators now, most of the educational content is zero-rated. The problem is that we found that it's rich content. It is bandwidth hungry, and it needs a good quality connection. And that just shows the need for infrastructure. Quality infrastructure remains a reality, because even if it's free, people are still struggling. Wrapping up comments, I think there's no question that computer, AI, mobility, etc., have changed the world profoundly. And the next wave of technologies from AI, cloud, blockchain, blah, 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 will change the world equally profoundly. COVID has shown us the huge social cost of not responding or being unable to respond to disruptions. And this next wave of tech disruption, I think, will be very profound. The job impact will be more profound over time than the COVID impact. And therefore, it's really important that we started talking about ecosystem responses at a specific intervention level. And I think we've got to take those conversations forward, because otherwise we are sitting here and fiddling our own balls.
And we didn't even really get to touch on the jobs elements in great detail. Dr. Andile, I'm wondering if you can perhaps also bring this through in your closing remarks. We were speaking about the fact that jobs are being lost right now, and COVID has accelerated the closing down of industries, making certain industries redundant, i.e., CASA, in your view. But this jobs bloodbath is with us, and we'll talk about the digital economy creating new jobs in industries. Where are they, and how do we get a player like Amazon, who's going to now create 3,000 jobs here in South Africa? How do we get more of those job creation testimonials? Dr. Andile?
Thank you. I think my conclusion is basically, I want to conclude with 3 things. The first one is bridging the digital divide as one of the top priorities that this country should have, between urban and rural, between township and suburban, between black and white. This is a big issue in our country. if any time has proved to be true, is COVID-19. The second most important issue is the involvement of Black people in the digital economy. This is linked to point number one and this point that I'm raising. Black people have no capital. And therefore, any policies and laws that inadvertently exclude them in spectrum in the digital environment, we will exacerbate this process. It is for that reason that I argue strongly that the issues of spectrum must be prioritized to Black people. The third and the last issue is that as a country, we are competing with other people in the region, in Africa, and in the continent. We cannot allow ourselves to be left behind. It is therefore juggling of these three issues at a policy level, at a country level, at a societal level, that none of them should be left behind. None of these three issues are less important than the other. I therefore call upon my colleagues in the mobile environment and those who run big companies to give a chance to Black companies to own spectrum and to be able to run future networks. The Nationalist Party, MTN and Vodacom were given spectrum by the Nationalist Party. They never was given this by auction. It was given to them for free. And we took over and we allowed them to continue. It's time for Black people to be given the same opportunity that these operators have been given in the last 30 years.
Thank you, Dr. Andile. Great insights there on bridging the digital divide. And Minister, as you also just prepare your conclusion or your wrap-up remarks, trying to incorporate what the speakers have said, I'd also like for you just to speak to what came up in my research as I was trying to prepare for this panel. And it was an industry player, in fact, a key industry player in the sector, talking about not underestimating the cost of the lost decade, as it were, in which we saw a massive corruption ensue in South Africa's economy that cost the taxpayer billions. And I'm talking about corruption on both ends now, the public sector as well as the private sector, not painting anyone with a black brush only. So as you just wrap up, perhaps also just a comment on the promise of the government to continue its ushering in of good governance, because this will be critical if we are going to make any headway in getting that 5.2 billion rand in investments and more that we are looking for.
Thank you, Fifi, and let me again thank the panelists for the great inputs that they made and the fact that they challenged us to go back to say we need to have a rethink of how we do things. But most importantly, I think they've started a way of creating a dialogue, which must therefore be extended to other people in order to have at least a coherent voice in terms of what is it that we need to do for South Africa. The speakers have raised all the important components that we really need to focus on as we drive digital transformation. And correctly so, Fifi, because from the government side, we haven't been doing well. I did acknowledge that we focused on certain elements whilst we left others behind, which is something that we are trying to do right now to address. And of course, I always tell people that I came at the right time by being given this position to have a president that appreciates the role of the ministry that we have, but that needs to be done by the society in order to leverage on the benefits and the economic spin-offs of the fourth industrial revolution. I always say that's an added plus, because the department would try to find itself to say this is what must be done. Then if that is not shared by the head of state, it poses a serious challenge, which makes it easier for even him to go an extra mile to say, let's reach out, let's go to private sector because we can't do it like this, go outside because as government you can't afford, listen to other people and all that. So that's one thing that we have learned from, to say it's going to help us change how we do things. Not only as the department, but as government is helping us change what is it that we need to do for South Africa when we're making laws, when we're considering everything that we have to do. That's why I emphasize the issue of incentives that must be introduced. Because you will find out that we focused on certain aspects and we left others, and we would have built more on others. I always like making an example with the electronics industry. If you look at the Mercedes-Benz and all that we have built more and then we have made lots of investment because we do have the capabilities. But it's about that thing of saying, how do we work together and understand the dependencies that we have in order to achieve those that we want to achieve. And as the department, Dr. Ngcaba, if you remember when we issued the policy direction, we then guided ICASA, directed ICASA to commission a study on the 5G ecosystem to say they must look into it and therefore they must provide the findings of the study so that when we issue the policy on 5G, it really addresses all these things that we're talking about. I know people are not happy with that because they feel like, no, we need 5G now, 4G, people already have done this and that, but reality is that there's still need for 4G. And the two bands that ICASA had included in the IM when they issue them, it's something that we need to do, what economic value that we'll achieve out of that, and how do then they go about licensing them in line with the policy objectives, which is why I said I like the fact that panelists that are so radical and even including certain things that we did not think about, but that dialogue therefore needs to be extended. Of course, as government, we are committed in ensuring good governance. I do think that one of the weaknesses that we've had over the years that we're still grappling with even now is that of making sure that we provide effective monitoring of the decisions that we have taken. It ends the day I issue or I deliver my budget vote in Parliament, the budget vote speech, and then the officials, the entities must go and do whatever. At times, you find that there's no alignment, which is what then we brought back to say the political principals are responsible for budget vote. But as you are responsible for budget vote, which means the allocation of the funding in terms of the distribution, that what is that needs to be done? We've got to agree on priorities. That's something that's very important. That's why we said, don't just come as the Department of Communications, I want to do A, B, C, D, and then water comes, but there's not going to be water that comes, we're just going to build a dam. What is it that we mean when we say we want to provide basic services, including internet? What measures can we put on board? So we are trying to reinforce our strategies, including building a capable state by upskilling our own personnel. That's why we're saying we need to work with everyone out there. President says we really need to have that social compact with the people, that the people must know that these are their own resources, and therefore it is in their interest to expose the wrongs that we do, and therefore they must not participate in them. So the ANC government is committed in driving good governance, and we are certain that even if it's not today, but we're certain that one day South Africa will have a great story to tell, like we did with the apartheid. And lastly, Fifi and attendees and the participants and the panelists, I want to say you've really challenged us, and therefore we're looking forward to having another, but that must be more inclusive engagement sooner. That must then help us before December comes. I think it's something that we need with the legislators and the regulator this time. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for participating.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Minister. Thank you to the panel. This is the inaugural discussion, or the digital infrastructure discussion at the inaugural Sustainable Investment or Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium. And I believe that we really got off on a great start and such great insights and great ideas and uncomfortable but necessary and robust and challenging ideas coming from the panelists. I'd like to thank all you attendees as well who have been listening patiently on this discussion. Thanks so much for your engagements, and thank you so much for your insights. Just one last thank you to the Honourable Minister the Honourable Ms. Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, who's the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies. Also Dr. Andile Ngcaba, the Commissioner for the President's 4IR Commission and Chairman of Convergence Partners. Dalibor Vavruska, the founder of Digitex Associates, and Prof. Brian Armstrong, Chair of the Digital Business University of the Witwatersrand. From myself, Fifi, here from Sandhurst, as it were. Thanks so much for your company, and see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.